There is a particular kind of torture that leaves no visible scars, and Drava had endured it for 6 years. Her father called it strengthening treatment. The elders called it necessary discipline. But when Marcus Thorne descended into the lower chambers of Garrick's compound and smelled the unmistakable scent of Bloodbane, a substance used only to prepare the dead for burial, he knew exactly what it was: systematic destruction disguised as care. Drava had the right to destroy her father. The law supported it. The clan would have accepted it. Her rage was justified, earned through 347 sessions of methodical poisoning. But when the moment came, she chose something harder than vengeance. She chose to let him live without dignity, to watch everything he built continue without him, to learn the same lesson he had spent years teaching her, that survival and living are not the same thing. This is a story about mercy that costs more than retribution. About daughters who refuse to let their father's violence define the shape of their power. About the moment you stop counting your scars as evidence of failure and start counting them as proof you refuse to break. Welcome to Orc-Vale Tales, where broken was always just another word for dangerous to those who wanted to control you. Welcome to Orc-Vale Tales, where we don't just tell fantasy stories, we excavate the human truths buried beneath the magic. If you felt something shift in your chest during that opening, if Drava's 347 scars made your own survival suddenly feel more significant, then you're exactly where you need to be. Here's what I know about you. You're tired of shallow stories that mistake violence for depth. You want narratives that respect your intelligence, that understand trauma isn't entertainment but transformation. You're the kind of person who sees broken and thinks, what were they trying to break, and why did it scare them so much? Hit that subscribe button right now. Not because I need the algorithm boost, though I do, but because you need to know what happens next, and missing the next chapter would actually hurt. The like button is right there. Use it. You'll regret it if you don't. Comment Sharkiva if you're ready to watch a girl who was taught to count her failures learn to count her victories instead. At mark 347, Drava realized she had been counting wrong her entire life. She had counted the days between rituals. She had counted the drops of Bloodbane extract Garrick measured into the bronze bowl, always 7, always precise. She had counted her own breaths during the poisoning, trying to make each one last longer than the one before, as if stretching time might somehow dilute what was happening to her body. But these were the wrong numbers. They were survivor's mathematics, a child's desperate attempt to impose order on something that had none. The smell came first, always. Bloodbane had a scent like copper and rotting fruit, sweet and metallic at once, and it clung to the ritual room in her father's compound like a stain that soap could not lift. Drava had learned to smell it from the corridor outside, learned to feel her stomach clench in anticipation before Garrick even called her name. The poisoning itself was methodical. Her father was never angry during these sessions, never raised his voice or struck her in frustration. He approached the work with a craftsman's detachment, the way another orc might approach the sharpening of a blade or the tanning of leather. "Hold still, Drava," he would say, and his tone was almost gentle. "This strengthens you. Your body learns to resist. Your sisters never needed this, but you were always the fragile one. Kessa the warrior, Volra the negotiator, and Drava, whose body rejected the orc blood that should have made her strong, whose muscles stayed lean where they should have been thick, whose tusks grew in crooked and small. Grishka, some of the clan elders called her when they thought she could not hear. Broken tusk. A thing that could not fulfill its purpose. The hollow feeling came after. Not pain, exactly, though there was pain. It was more like absence, as if the Bloodbane scoured something essential from her insides and left only empty space behind. Drava would lie on the floor of the ritual room afterward, staring at the ceiling beams and counting the whorls in the wood grain, and she would think about the difference between surviving and living. One was the continuation of breath and heartbeat. The other was something she was beginning to suspect she had never actually experienced. By mark 347, she had survived 346 of these sessions. She had counted each one like a merchant counts coins, hoarding them as proof of her endurance. But endurance was not the same as strength, and proof was not the same as worth. The numbers were meaningless. They were marks on a wall in a cell, scratches that changed nothing about the cell itself. She lay on the cold stone and tried to calculate differently. How many years had she spent becoming smaller? How many hours had she wasted trying to please a father who looked at her and saw only disappointment? How many versions of herself had she buried in this room, one ritual at a time, until she could no longer remember what the first version had been like? The counts did not add up to anything coherent. They were just numbers, accumulating without purpose, and Drava felt something crack inside her that had nothing to do with Bloodbane or poison or her father's methodical cruelty. Then she heard it. Footsteps overhead, too early for the evening crowd. The tavern above the compound was always empty at this hour, but someone was moving around up there with purpose, rearranging furniture, opening shutters. A human voice called out something she could not quite make out through the floorboards, the syllables unfamiliar and light. Something in Drava's chest flickered. Not hope, not yet. But something adjacent to it. A recognition that there were other kinds of counting she had never learned, other numbers that might actually matter. She pressed her palm flat against the stone floor and felt the vibration of footsteps, proof that the world was larger than this room, larger than her father's compound, larger than the mathematics of survival she had been practicing for so long. Marcus Thorne had been called many things in his 18 years of studying Orc culture, but the name that mattered most was the one the Gravesinger clan had given him, He Who Speaks with the Green. It was a title earned through winters spent learning Thunder Tongue until his human tongue could properly roll the guttural consonants, through summers observing their death rites and harvest celebrations, through the slow building of trust that came only when you stopped trying to translate everything into terms your own people would understand. He had lived among the Gravelsingers for 3 years, had learned to read the complex web of obligation and honor that structured Orc society, had even participated in the Feast of Broken Chains when they welcomed him as kin by choice rather than kin by blood. He knew Orcs. He knew their customs, their languages, their values. He knew them well enough to know when something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The smell hit him the moment he climbed the stairs to Garrick's private quarters. Bloodbane. The scent was unmistakable once you had encountered it, that peculiar combination of sweet rot and metal that clung to everything it touched. Marcus had smelled it twice before in his years of research, both times in the context of funerary rites, where small amounts were used to prepare bodies for the sky burial practiced by some northern clans. It had no business being here, among the living, concentrated enough that he could detect it through the heavy door at the top of the stairs. His hand hesitated on the door frame. Memories had teeth, and these ones were particularly sharp. 10 years ago, he had been younger, more idealistic, more convinced that understanding could prevent violence. He had been consulting for a settlement called Thornhaven, helping them navigate trade agreements with a nearby Orc clan whose customs they barely comprehended. He had thought he was building bridges. Then the misunderstanding happened, a careless insult during negotiations that he should have caught, should have smoothed over, should have explained before it metastasized into rage. 43 people died in the massacre that followed. 43 people whose names he still remembered, whose faces still visited him in the space between sleep and waking. He had counted them the way some people count prayers, a litany of failure that no amount of subsequent success could erase. The door opened before he could knock. Garrick stood there, a broad-shouldered Orc with iron-grey tusks and the kind of presence that seemed to compress the air around him. Behind him, 2 daughters. The first was clearly Kessa, built like a siege engine, with scars that told stories of earned glory and eyes that assessed Marcus with the casual calculation of someone who could break him in half without much effort. The second was Volra, Lena, watching him with the same intensity but different intent, already cataloguing what he might want and how she might provide it in exchange for advantage. Marcus Thorne, Garrick said in accented but fluent common. Your reputation precedes you. My daughters, Kessa and Volra. Marcus bowed in the Orcish style, fist to chest, and responded in Thunder Tongue. The honor is mine, Garrick of the Ironwood. Your hospitality is a gift I do not take lightly. He glanced at the 2 daughters, then back to Garrick, feeling the absence like a missing tooth. The intelligence he had gathered mentioned 3 daughters. Clans kept track of these things, and the Ironwood clan was prominent enough that its family structure was common knowledge among those who studied such matters. "Please, sit," Garrick gestured to cushions arranged around a low table. "We have much to discuss regarding the Stormridge clan's territories." Marcus sat, but his mind was working through what he was observing. 2 daughters present, introduced with pride. 1 daughter absent, unmentioned. The smell of Bloodbane saturating the private quarters. Garrick's controlled demeanor, the kind of calm that came from practice rather than peace. This was not neglect. Neglect was passive, a failure of attention. What Marcus was sensing was active, deliberate. This was erasure, the systematic removal of someone from the narrative of family and clan. He had seen it once before among the Gravelsingers, when a son had committed an unforgivable betrayal and been declared shadowkin, a person whose name could no longer be spoken, whose existence became a blank space in the family history. But that had been justice, harsh but comprehensible within the framework of Orcish law. This felt different. This felt like something being hidden rather than something being punished, and the distinction made Marcus's stomach tighten with old, familiar dread. He was missing something. And in his experience, the things people worked hardest to hide were usually the things that mattered most. The lower chambers had their own geography, and Drava had mapped every inch of it through necessity. She knew which stones in the floor retained cold the longest, useful for pressing against her forehead when the Bloodbane made her skull feel like it might crack open from the inside. She knew the exact angle to hold her hands during the rituals, palms up at 45 degrees, because anything else made Garrick restart the session. She knew the breathing pattern that minimized nausea, for counts in, hold for 7, 6 counts out, repeat until the hollow feeling passed or she lost consciousness, whichever came first. These were the skills she had cultivated, the expertise of endurance. She had become fluent in the language of minimum duration. The geometry of survival was precise. Stand 3 feet from the bronze bowl, never closer. Keep your eyes fixed on the far wall, never on Garrick's face or the measuring implements. Swallow immediately when told, do not hesitate, do not gag, do not give him reason to extend the ritual with lectures about weakness and discipline. Afterward, curl on your left side, not your right, because the left position kept pressure off the organs that hurt most. Count something, anything, to keep your mind from splintering into the kind of panic that made everything worse. She had learned these rules the way scholars learned languages, through repetition and pain and the desperate need to find some framework that made the unbearable slightly more bearable. At 16, she had undergone her Seer trial, the rite of passage where young orcs were meant to channel their rage into something pure and powerful, proving themselves worthy of full clan status. Drava had stood in the trial circle while the war drums pounded and the clan elders watched, and she had tried desperately to summon the fury that should have lived in her blood. She had thought of every humiliation, every disappointment, every session in the ritual room. She had tried to forge it all into the kind of burning anger that would satisfy the watching eyes. But what came instead was her mother's voice, soft and singing, the lullaby about the firebird who burned too bright for the world to hold. The memory had wrapped around her like a blanket, and instead of roaring she had wept. The silence that followed had been absolute. Kessa had raged for 3 hours during her trial, had broken training weapons and left claw marks in the stone. Volra had negotiated her way through the challenges with such cunning that the elders had laughed in approval and called her sharp as winter wind. Drava had cried and been declared incomplete, a half-thing that could not access the fundamental nature of what she was supposed to be. Kessa visited sometimes, always late at night when Garrick was occupied elsewhere. She would sit outside the locked door to Drava's chamber and talk in low tones about nothing important, weather and tavern gossip, the quality of the meat shipment from the southern farms. Anything except the truth they both knew. There was guilt in her sister's voice, thick and obvious, but there was also fear. Kessa could break iron chains with her bare hands but could not break the ones their father had wrapped around all of them. She was a warrior, trained to identify enemies and destroy them, but she had never learned how to fight the quiet violence that happened behind closed doors, the kind that left no scars visible enough to justify intervention. Volra never visited. She was too busy building alliances, positioning herself for when she would inherit Garrick's authority and his network of contacts. She had made herself willfully blind to what happened in the lower chambers, had calculated that Drava's suffering was an acceptable cost for her own advancement. Sometimes Drava heard her voice upstairs in the tavern, laughing with merchants and clan representatives, and she wondered if Volra ever thought about her at all, or if she had become just another piece of furniture in the compound, something that existed but did not require acknowledgement. The worst part was not the pain or the isolation or even the Bloodbane itself. The worst part was the hope that refused to die completely, the small voice that whispered before each session that maybe this time it would work. Maybe this time her body would respond the way Garrick insisted it should. Maybe this time she would feel the rage, the strength, the transformation that would make her whole in his eyes. The hope was more poisonous than anything in the bronze bowl because it kept her complicit in her own destruction, made her believe that if she just endured one more session, just tried one more time, just held her hands at exactly the right angle and breathed in exactly the right pattern, everything would change. Her mother had disappeared when Drava was 9 years old. Before that, she had called Drava Sharkiva, Flameheart, and had sung songs about burning bright. Then one morning she was simply gone, and Garrick's explanation had been brief and final. Your mother has left to join another clan. She will not return. But Drava had never believed it, not really. Her mother's belongings had remained untouched for weeks, her favorite shawl still draped over the chair where she used to sit. The disappearance had the quality of erasure rather than departure, another absence that no one would discuss. Marcus waited until midnight, when the tavern had emptied and the compound had settled into the particular silence that comes only when people believe themselves unobserved. He moved through the corridors with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned to navigate Orc architecture, where floors were built to bear tremendous weight and rarely creaked under human footsteps. The smell of Bloodbane grew stronger as he descended, a scent that had no business being this concentrated, this persistent, anywhere that living people dwelled. The ceremonial chamber was at the bottom of a narrow staircase, behind a door that was locked but not barred. Marcus had tools for locks, small implements he had acquired during his years of research when access to restricted spaces sometimes meant the difference between understanding and ignorance. The lock gave way with a soft click that sounded too loud in the stillness. She was curled on the floor in the corner, a small figure in the shadows that resolved into an Orc-woman as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Young, maybe early 20s, with tusks that grew in crooked and a frame that spoke of careful starvation rather than natural build. Her eyes opened when he entered, and there was no surprise in them, only a dull wariness that suggested she had stopped expecting anything good from open doors. "Who are you?" Her voice was steady despite everything, and she spoke in Thundertongue with an accent he recognized as Northern Clan dialect. "My name is Marcus Thorn," he replied in the same language. "I'm a cultural consultant working with your father. I smelled Bloodbane and came to investigate." He stayed near the door, keeping his posture non-threatening, letting her see his empty hands. "How long has he been poisoning you?" Something flickered across her face, too quick to identify. "It's not poisoning. It's strengthening treatment. My body rejects what I should be, and the Bloodbane helps correct the imbalance." The words came out practiced, a script she had recited so many times it had worn grooves in her mind. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had seen this before, not in his work with orcs but in human contexts, the way victims learn to speak their abusers' language, to adopt their frameworks and justifications. Bloodbane is a funeral preparation agent. It's used to break down tissue for sky burial rituals. There is no therapeutic application for living subjects. What he's doing to you is torture dressed up in medical terminology. You don't understand what it means to be Grishka. She sat up slowly, her movements careful, as if her body hurt in ways she had learned to accommodate. Broken tusk. Incomplete. My sisters have strength and cunning. I have nothing. Without the treatments, I'm just a burden to the clan, a weakness that reflects poorly on my father's bloodline. And with the treatments? Marcus kept his voice level, though fury was building in his chest. the cold controlled kind that came from seeing suffering and recognizing its architecture. "What do you have with the treatments?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again her voice was smaller. "Purpose. Even if it's just the purpose of trying." Marcus had spent 18 years studying Orc culture, learning to see the world through frameworks that were not his own, respecting values and practices that differed from human norms. But some things transcended cultural context. Some things were simply wrong, regardless of what justifications were layered on top of them. He looked at this woman who had been convinced that her own destruction was a form of self-improvement, and he recognized the depth of the problem he was facing. She was not a victim who wanted rescue. She was a prisoner who believed she deserved the prison. "Listen to me carefully," he said, moving slightly closer but still maintaining distance. "What your father is doing is not recognized by any clan I've studied. It violates the fundamental principle of Karshera, the honor debt that parents owe to children they bring into the world. Bloodbane poisoning causes permanent damage to organs, nerve degradation, and eventual system failure. You are not being strengthened. You are being slowly killed. Why do you care?" The question was not hostile, just genuinely confused, as if kindness from strangers was a concept she could not quite process. "This isn't your concern. You're here for territorial negotiations, not to interfere with clan business." Marcus thought about Thornhaven, about 43 people he had failed to save because he had prioritized professional boundaries over moral action. He thought about all the years since then, the careful distance he had maintained, the way he had told himself that observation was enough, that understanding was sufficient. He was tired of counting failures. "It's my concern now," he said. "And whether you believe it or not, you deserve better than this. Let me help you." "Show me the marks," Marcus said on his third visit, and Drava hesitated before pulling up her sleeves. The scars ran up both forearms in neat rows, small deliberate cuts she had made herself to keep count. 347 marks, each one representing a session survived. Marcus studied them in the lamplight, his expression unreadable. Then he said something that rearranged the geometry of her entire existence. "These aren't failures. These are survivals. You've endured something that would have killed most people, and you're still here. That's not weakness. That's extraordinary strength of a kind your father doesn't have the capacity to recognize." Drava cried then, for the first time in years. Not from pain or fear or even grief, but from the strange vertigo of being seen differently than she had ever seen herself. The tears came hot and sudden, and she could not stop them, could not control the way her body shook with the force of releasing something she had kept compressed for so long. Marcus brought her medicines from the Gravesinger clan, counteragents developed for accidental bloodbane exposure during funeral rites. He came every night under the cover story that Drava was his cultural consultant for the treaty work, someone who could provide insight into clan dynamics that Garrick and his other daughters could not. Garrick accepted this explanation with barely concealed contempt, pleased to find some use for his broken daughter but skeptical that she had anything valuable to offer. As the bloodbane cleared from her system, fragments returned. Memories she thought she had lost surfaced like bodies rising from deep water. Her mother's face, clearer now. Her mother's voice singing Sharkiva, Flameheart, my girl who burns too bright. Her mother's hands, gentle on her crooked tusks, saying they were perfect, saying she was perfect exactly as she was. The memories did not come with context or explanation, just sensory fragments that felt both impossibly distant and painfully immediate. The rage came on the 7th night of treatment. It built slowly, a pressure in her chest that spread through her limbs until her hands were shaking with it. She waited until Marcus left, then she began to destroy her chamber with quiet, methodical precision. She broke the counting stones she had collected. She tore the blankets into strips. She shattered the bronze bowl Garrick used for the rituals, smashing it again and again until it was nothing but fragments scattered across the floor. Marcus found her sitting in the wreckage, breathing hard, her knuckles bleeding. He did not look shocked or disappointed. He simply sat down across from her and waited until she could speak. "I want to kill him," she said finally, and the words felt like confession and revelation at once. That rage is fair, Marcus said. You're allowed to feel it. You've earned it. But you have to decide what you do with it. You can burn everything down, or you can forge something new. Either choice is yours, not his. That's what freedom actually means. The visions intensified as the Bloodbane cleared, becoming more coherent, more insistent. Drava saw herself at 8 years old, sitting cross-legged in her mother's private chamber while sunlight streamed through the high windows. Her mother was teaching her something, hands moving in specific patterns, voice low and rhythmic. Close your eyes, Sharkiva. Feel the fire that lives in your chest. Not the rage they will try to teach you later, but the other flame. The one that sees. The memory fragmented there, dissolving into sensation without image. Warmth spreading through her small body. Her mother's smile. The sense that she had touched something vast and incomprehensible, something that lived just beneath the surface of ordinary perception. Then her mother's face turning serious, urgent. You must never show your father this gift. He will not understand. He will try to extinguish it. Drava woke from these visions gasping, her heart pounding, and the word her mother had used echoed in her mind. Flameheart Seer. She did not know what it meant, only that it felt important, a key to a door she had not known existed. Kessa came to Marcus 3 nights later, finding him in the small room Garrick had provided for his stay. She stood in the doorway like a soldier reporting for punishment, her massive frame somehow diminished by shame. I knew something was wrong, she said without preamble. Not the details, but enough. I knew he was hurting her. I knew it wasn't training or medicine or any of the things he called it. And I did nothing. I was afraid. Marcus looked at her steadily, this warrior who could break stone with her bare hands but had been broken by something more insidious than physical threat. What were you afraid of? That he would do to me what he did to our mother. Kessa's voice cracked on the last word. She tried to take Drava away. He stopped her. She disappeared. Everyone says she left, but I was 12 and I knew better. I knew, and I stayed silent, and I let him have Drava instead because I was too much of a coward to risk the same fate. Volra's visit came differently. She walked into the lower chambers in the middle of the day, when Garrick was away on clan business, and she stood looking at Drava with an expression that contained no softness but at least approached honesty. Did you know? Drava asked, because there was no point in anything else now. Yes. Volra did not look away, did not try to cushion the admission with justification. I knew he was poisoning you. I knew it was destroying you. And I did nothing because helping you would have cost me everything I'd built. Every alliance I'd cultivated, every relationship I'd forged with the clan elders who respect him. If I had intervened, I would have lost it all. So you chose your ambition over my life. Drava's voice was flat, too exhausted for real anger. Yes. Volra crossed her arms, her posture defensive despite her words. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it and I don't expect it. But you should know the truth. I made a calculation, and you were the cost. I chose power over sisterhood, and I'll have to live with that. I just thought you should hear it from me rather than figuring it out yourself. There was something almost respectful in the brutal honesty, her acknowledgement that Drava was owed at least the dignity of truth even if she could not be given anything else. Volra left without another word, and Drava sat in the silence that followed, turning the confession over in her mind like a stone. Marcus spent the next 2 days researching, finally tracking down the clan's elder historian in a neighboring territory. The old orc listened to his questions with growing understanding, then pulled out records that went back 3 generations. Flameheart seers, he explained in Thundertongue thick with age, are rare. They see what others cannot, read intentions and futures, perceive the patterns that govern chance and choice. The gift runs in bloodlines but skips generations unpredictably. They are valued by some clans, feared by others. A seer cannot be controlled through conventional means. They see through deception, resist manipulation. For someone like Garrick, who built his power on careful control of information and image, a daughter with that gift would be intolerable. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as understanding crystallized. He didn't break her because she was weak. No, the historian agreed. He broke her because she was dangerous. because she would have seen him clearly, and he could not allow that. The Bloodbane does more than damage the body. It clouds the inner vision, disrupts the gift. He was not trying to strengthen her. He was trying to blind her. Garrick had always believed he was a practical man, someone who understood that leadership required difficult choices and that sentiment was a luxury afforded only to those without responsibility. 8 years ago, when the harvests had failed for the third consecutive season and the border conflict with the Razorclaw clan had escalated into something that threatened full territorial war, he had done what was necessary. The blood debt agreements he had negotiated in secret were elegant solutions to impossible problems. The Razorclaws would receive certain trade concessions and intelligence about northern clan movements. In exchange, they would maintain the public posture of rivalry while privately supporting Ironwood's economic stability. 3,000 orcs in his territory would survive the winter. The clan would remain strong. But blood debt agreements of that nature were explicitly forbidden by interclan law, considered treasonous collaboration that undermined the fundamental structure of clan sovereignty. Discovery would mean execution for Garrick and complete dissolution of the Ironwood clan's authority, its members scattered and absorbed into other territories without honor or protection. The stakes were not abstract. They were the difference between survival and annihilation for everyone who depended on his leadership. When Drava had stood in her Khazir circle at 16 and begun to exhibit the telltale signs of Flameheart sight, that particular terror of perception that could strip away careful lies and see the truth beneath constructed reality, Garrick had understood with absolute clarity that she represented an existential threat to everything he had built. He had watched her eyes during the trial, seen the way they seemed to focus on things that were not visible, the way her body had responded not to the physical challenges before her but to something deeper and more dangerous. She had been reaching for the gift, unconsciously trying to access a power that would have let her see through every deception he had carefully maintained. He told himself the mathematics were simple. One daughter's suffering measured against 3,000 lives. One girl's potential measured against the survival of an entire clan structure. It was not cruelty but necessity, not abuse but strategic sacrifice. The Bloodbane had been his solution, researched carefully, administered with precision. It clouded the inner vision, disrupted the gift before it could fully manifest. He had genuinely believed, and continued to believe, that he was protecting his people through the systematic destruction of his youngest child. In his darkest hours, when guilt threatened to surface, he reminded himself that leaders made choices others could not stomach. That was the burden of authority. That was the price of keeping 3,000 people alive. He had never expected to feel relief at her suffering, but there had been a certain cold satisfaction in watching the Flameheart gift fail to emerge, in seeing her remain blind to the truths that would have destroyed them all. Better one daughter broken than an entire clan dissolved. Better her pain than mass starvation and territorial collapse. He had built a fortress of justification around his actions, each stone carefully placed, each argument reinforcing the next until the structure felt unassailable. Marcus found the proof buried in old trade ledgers stored in the compound's lower archive, coded references that meant nothing until you understood what you were looking for. Shipments marked as grain that corresponded to Razorclaw harvest patterns. Payment schedules that aligned with border skirmishes that had ended too cleanly, too quickly. The pattern of agreements, the flow of resources, the careful documentation of debts owed and favors exchanged. He sat in the archive room with the evidence spread before him and felt the weight of an impossible question pressing against his chest. Was he choosing one life over 3,000? If Garrick fell, if the blood debt conspiracy was exposed, would the resulting chaos destroy more people than it saved? The Interclan Council would demand justice, would dismantle the Ironwood clan structure, would redistribute its territories in ways that might spark new conflicts. Drava's liberation could mean widespread suffering for people who had no part in her imprisonment. The utilitarian calculus was uncomfortably clear, and Marcus had spent enough years studying ethics to know that there were frameworks that would justify leaving her in that chamber, that would mark her suffering as regrettable but necessary collateral damage in service of a greater good. He did not have a clean answer. He knew only that watching Drava die slowly in the lower chambers while telling himself it served some greater strategic purpose felt like Thornhaven all over again, felt like choosing abstract principles over concrete suffering. The 43 people he had failed to save haunted him precisely because he had prioritized theory over action, had believed that understanding systems mattered more than protecting individuals. He would help her. He would face whatever consequences came from that choice, would navigate whatever chaos resulted, but he would not stand by and count justifications while someone died in front of him. Garrick realized Marcus knew too much on a Thursday morning when he found the human in the archive room, surrounded by ledgers that should have meant nothing to an outsider. Their eyes met, and understanding passed between them without words. Marcus saw the calculation happening behind Garrick's expression, watched him arrive at the only conclusion that protected his carefully constructed survival. That evening, Garrick announced there would be a public discipline ceremony. Drava would undergo the final inking, the ritual that marked clan members as permanently bound to their current status. It was a ceremony rarely used, reserved for those whose nature required permanent definition. After the inking, her status as incomplete would be carved into her flesh, made visible, made permanent. And Marcus, who had seen too much and understood too clearly, would be required to witness what happened when outsiders interfered with clan justice. The clan gathered in the great hall at dawn, summoned by drums that spoke of discipline and judgment. 300 orcs filled the space, their presence transforming the hall into something that felt both sacred and predatory. Garrick stood at the center, his voice carrying to the furthest corners as he outlined the accusations. His daughter Drava had been spreading lies to outsiders, breaching clan honor, undermining the authority that kept them all safe. She had convinced the human consultant that legitimate strengthening treatments were abuse, had manipulated his ignorance of their ways to paint her father as a monster. She required correction, permanent and visible, so that no one would mistake her incomplete nature for something it was not. Drava was brought to the center of the hall barefoot and exhausted, her body moving through the motions it had learned through years of conditioning. She knelt without being told, placed her hands flat at the precise angle that minimized duration, fixed her eyes on a point on the far wall. The geometry of survival was ingrained so deeply that she performed it without conscious thought, even now, even here. She was prepared to endure one more session. She had survived 347. She could survive 348. Marcus stepped forward before Garrick could begin, his voice ringing out in thundertongue. I invoke Karathma, the right of champion. I place myself between this judgment and this woman. If you wish to proceed, you must go through me first. The hall went silent. Karathma was an ancient rite, rarely invoked, and never by outsiders. But the words were sacred once spoken, binding even clan leaders to the framework of honor that governed such challenges. Garrick's expression twisted with fury, and he moved faster than Marcus expected. One blow sent the human sprawling, blood streaming from his split lip. This is not your business, human. You have no standing here, no right to interfere with clan justice. Garrick turned back to Drava, pulling out the ceremonial needle, the one used for permanent inking. But this needle was different. Marcus saw through blurred vision. This needle was aimed not at skin but at spine, positioned to sever something essential. This was not inking. This was execution disguised as ceremony. Everything erupted. The fire came from somewhere deep inside Drava, from a place that had been compressed and poisoned and buried but never quite extinguished. It exploded outward with a force that shattered the geometry of the hall, flames that were not quite flames, light that was not quite light, power that bent perception and made reality feel suddenly thin and negotiable. The walls became screens for visions that were not Drava's alone but belonged to 1,000 years of Flameheart seers, their memories cascading through her and projecting outward for everyone to witness. In the center of the firestorm, Drava saw herself. Not as she was now but as she had been at 16, standing in the Khazir circle, her eyes full of confused pain. The younger version looked at her with recognition and something like accusation. Why didn't you fight? Because I believed him, present Drava said, and her voice carried through dimensions that had no names. Because I thought he was right about what I was. I'm sorry. "We weren't broken," the younger self said, and there was certainty in her voice that the older version had lost somewhere along the way. "No," Drava agreed, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. "We never were." The younger self began to fade, but as she did, the power that had been destroying everything began instead to channel, to focus, to become something other than pure destruction. The visions on the walls shifted, showing not just history but truth. Garrick's hands glowing with residue of Bloodbane, years of poisoning made visible in the firelight. His secret meetings with Razorclaw representatives. His blood debt agreements written in his own hand. Every careful deception stripped away and laid bare for the assembled clan to witness. Drava was dying. Marcus could see it even through the chaos, the way her body was being consumed by power it had never been trained to channel. He crawled toward her, ignoring his own pain, and grabbed her hand. "Grakmor Sharazi," he shouted in Thunder Tongue, the phrase that meant remember your name, remember yourself. Your real name. The one your mother gave you. "Sharkiva," Drava whispered, and the word acted like an anchor thrown into violent water. "Flameheart." The power stuttered, stabilized, began to flow instead of explode. She collapsed into Marcus's arms, unconscious but breathing, her pulse rapid but steady under his fingers. The silence in the great hall was absolute. 300 orcs stood frozen, having witnessed both a Flameheart's awakening and the complete exposure of Garrick's betrayal. The walls still flickered with after-images of truth, and there was no way to unsee what had been revealed, no way to pretend that the foundations of their clan had not just been shown to be built on lies and the systematic destruction of an innocent. The formal clan council convened 3 days later in the Great Hall, with representatives from 7 neighboring clans present to witness what would either be justice or catastrophe. The hall was arranged according to ancient protocol, with the accused standing in the center and the council seated in a wide circle around him. Garrick stood with his shoulders straight, his expression revealing nothing, though Marcus noticed the way his hands trembled slightly before he clasped them behind his back. The charges were read in Thunder Tongue, each one carrying the weight of centuries of clan law. Unauthorized blood debt agreements with rival clans. Treason against interclan sovereignty. The systematic poisoning of his own daughter to prevent her Flameheart gift from exposing his corruption. Attempted murder during a sacred discipline ceremony. The list went on, each accusation more damning than the last, and the assembled witnesses murmured among themselves as the full scope of his actions became clear. Garrick's defense, when he was finally allowed to speak, was delivered with the same controlled precision he brought to everything. "I do not deny what I have done. Every action I took was calculated to preserve this clan's survival. 8 years ago, we faced annihilation. Failed harvests, territorial conflict, the very real possibility that 3,000 orcs under my protection would starve or be scattered to other clans without honor. I made agreements that violated law but saved lives. When my daughter's gift threatened to expose those agreements and bring destruction upon us all, I made another choice. One daughter's suffering, or 3,000 orcs' survival. I chose the many over the one. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, then I accept that judgment. But I will not apologize for keeping my people alive." The council was split, and the division was visible in the way they sat and spoke. Some of the older members nodded grimly, understanding the mathematics of leadership in desperate times. They had made their own terrible choices, had sacrificed their own pieces on the board to keep the larger structure intact. Others looked at Garrick with undisguised disgust, seeing only cruelty dressed up in utilitarian language, seeing a father who had tortured his child and called it necessity. Drava sat to the side, still weak from the awakening, her body not yet fully recovered from channeling power it had never been trained to hold. Marcus sat beside her, close enough to catch her if she fell but far enough to make clear that this decision was hers alone. She listened to the argument swirl around her, watched the council divide itself into factions, and felt the weight of choice pressing against her chest like a physical thing. She had the right to destroy him. Everyone in the hall knew it. Clan law gave victims of such profound betrayal the authority to demand execution, and no one would question that judgment. She had the power to make him suffer, to subject him to the same systematic torture he had inflicted on her, to let him feel every session of Bloodbane poisoning, every moment of isolation, every drop of hope slowly poisoned until nothing remained. The rage was still there, burning in her chest, and it would be so easy to feed it, to let it consume everything until nothing was left but ash and vengeance. She remembered Marcus's words from that night in the destroyed chamber. Rage is fuel. It can burn everything down, or forge something new. She remembered her 16-year-old self asking, "Why didn't you fight?" and she understood now that this was the fight. Not the explosion of power in the Great Hall, not the dramatic awakening that had stripped away Garrick's deceptions. This quiet moment, this choice about what to do with justified fury, this was where the real battle happened. If she called for his execution, she would be letting him define the terms one final time. He had spent years teaching her that she was incomplete, that her value was measured by her ability to become what he wanted. If she killed him, she would be accepting that framework, proving that his choices had succeeded in making her into someone whose primary relationship with him was destruction. But if she chose differently, if she stepped outside the geometry of revenge he had constructed, she could forge something he had never anticipated. "I strip you of your title," she said, and her voice carried through the hall despite its weakness. "You will not lead this clan. You will not represent us in negotiations. You will not make decisions that affect anyone but yourself. But I do not call for your execution." The hall erupted in confused murmuring. Garrick's expression flickered with something that might have been relief or might have been incomprehension. "You taught me how to survive shame, Father," Drava continued, and there was no forgiveness in her tone, but there was something harder and more deliberate. "You taught me what it means to live without dignity, to exist in a space where everyone knows what you are and no one respects you for it. You taught me how to endure being present but powerless, watching others succeed while you remain trapped in your own inadequacy. Now you'll learn the same lesson. You will live in this clan. You will watch your daughters lead without you. You will see everything you tried to build continue without your influence. And every day, you will know that the daughter you tried to break was strong enough to show you mercy you did not deserve." The council deliberated for 2 more hours, but the outcome was never truly in question. Drava's judgment was accepted. Kessa was named as the new Warchief, her strength and combat prowess making her the natural choice for military leadership. Volra took over external relations and threw herself into the complex work of restructuring the Razorclaw debt agreements, finding legal pathways to honor the survival those agreements had provided while extricating the clan from ongoing treason. And Drava claimed her role as Flameheart Seer, the first her clan had acknowledged in 3 generations, the gift her father had tried to extinguish now burning steady and clear for everyone to witness. 3 months after the trial, Drava stood in the ceremonial chamber that had once been the geography of her survival and tried to imagine it as something else. Her new role as Flameheart Seer came with responsibilities she was still learning to navigate, spiritual advisor and keeper of memory for a clan that had spent generations forgetting what such a position actually meant. The physical toll of the awakening had left permanent marks. Her hands bore Flameheart scars that glowed softly in darkness and ached in cold weather, thin lines of light that traced up her forearms like the marks she had once carved to count sessions survived. The irony was not lost on her. She was converting the chamber into a memory archive, a place where the clan's true history could be preserved rather than the edited version Garrick had maintained. Chronicle stones lined the walls now, each one inscribed with testimonies and records that had been hidden or suppressed. Marcus was there, helping her arrange them according to the organizational system she had designed. Her hands were aching badly today, the cold autumn air seeping through the ventilation slits and making the scars pulse with remembered pain, so he did the physical work while she directed from where she sat on the stone bench. "The stone from the Gravesinger clan goes on the eastern wall," she said, and Marcus nodded, carrying it carefully to the designated spot. "That's where we're keeping records of inter-clan cooperation. The western wall is for family histories, the northern for prophecies and visions." He worked in silence for a while, the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had learned to exist together without needing to fill every moment with words. Finally, he set down the stone he was holding and turned to face her. "You don't have to keep me here, you know. The treaty work is finished. I could leave, give you space to build this without an outsider watching. You're not staying for the treaty, Drava said, and it was not a question. No. Marcus sat down beside her, careful not to crowd her space. I'm staying because I need to know that this actually worked. That you're actually going to be okay. And I'm staying because I still carry Thornhaven with me everywhere I go, and I don't know if what I did here was enough to balance that scale. You think saving me redeems you for the 43 people you couldn't save? Drava's voice was gentle but direct, the Flameheart gift giving her insight into the shape of his guilt even when he did not speak it aloud. I didn't save you, Marcus said quietly. I witnessed. I provided medicine and information. But you're the one who survived, who chose not to let that survival destroy you. And I still don't know if witnessing was enough, if it counts for anything against the times I failed to act. It was enough, Drava said, and she meant it. Because sometimes all we need is for someone to believe we're worth witnessing. You couldn't make my choices for me, couldn't take away the pain or undo the years of damage. But you saw me as something other than broken, and that mattered. That was the thing I needed most and didn't know how to ask for. Their relationship existed in a space that neither culture's terms could quite define. Not an student, not savior and saved, not even quite friends in the way either of their peoples would recognize friendship. But it was real and it was healing, and Drava had learned that sometimes the most important things existed in the undefined spaces between categories. She looked down at her scarred hands, at the marks that ran up her forearms. I counted these wrong for 6 years. I thought they were evidence I was broken, proof that I needed fixing. But they're evidence I survived. They're a record of endurance that I couldn't see correctly until someone helped me change the way I was looking. They're evidence you were never broken to begin with, Marcus said. Broken things don't survive 347 attempts to break them. They shatter long before that. What you are is something that bends but doesn't break, something that absorbs damage and continues anyway. That's not weakness. That's the opposite of weakness. Sunlight streamed through the ventilation slits, illuminating dust motes in the air and casting patterns across the chronicle stones. The doors to the chamber stood open, had stood open every day since the trial, would stand open from now on. Drava stood slowly, her hands still aching but manageable, and walked deeper into the room that used to be her prison. She was turning it into something beautiful, something that would serve memory and truth rather than concealment and pain. Marcus watched her move through the space with growing confidence, watched her begin to arrange stones with her own hands despite the ache, watched her claim this room as hers in a way it had never been before. You were never the broken thing, he said softly. You were always the thing that refused to break. So here's what I need you to sit with. Drava had the right to destroy Garrick. The law supported it. The clan would have accepted it. Her rage was justified, earned through 6 years of methodical torture. But she chose mercy instead, not because he deserved it, but because she refused to let his violence define the shape of her power. Here's my question for you, and I want you to really think about this before you answer. Is mercy always the higher choice, or are there crimes so profound that forgiveness becomes complicity? If someone spent years systematically destroying you while calling it love, would you be strong enough to choose transformation over retribution? Or is retribution sometimes the only honest response to betrayal that deep? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Like this video if it changed something in you. Subscribe because the next story will cut even deeper. And comment 347 if you've ever had to relearn how to count your own worth. What would you have done with Garrick? And be honest, because the easy answer isn't always the true one.